Hello, welcome to EE380, the Stanford Electrical Engineering Department colloquium on computer systems. Our speaker today is Stephen Pu. Stephen is the founder and CEO of Taxara, and he's going to be speaking today on practical blockchain applications. Steve?
All right. Thank you very much, Dennis. So my name is Stephen, and I hope everyone is keeping safe and healthy during this pandemic. So today we're going to talk a little bit about practical blockchain applications with an emphasis on practical, because blockchain is such a new technology. I think the entire space is really searching for large-scale mainstream applications upon which this technology can be effectively deployed. Right. So let's dig into it. So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction. Okay, so the project's name is Taxara. So we're a public ledger that's focused on streamlining operational processes and microagreements. We're founded in 2018 by a few guys from Stanford. We're a fully distributed team in Silicon Valley, Tokyo, Shanghai, Ukraine, and a few other places. A little bit about myself. I was an entrepreneur in wireless sensor networks and mobile health. I was most recently a strategy consultant, associate partner at Monitor Deloitte, advising large companies in digital strategy. And I was the graduate of Stanford's EE department. Okay, so a little bit about what to expect from today's talk. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to share our learnings, right? So because this is such a new field and things are changing every day, we are going to share with you our journey in our attempt, right, to find real-world applications, right, that actually solve commercial problems, right? So the second thing is that this talk is going to be very, very application-focused. Once again, the reason is that because in the previous few years, the emphasis has been largely on the core technology, but a lot of the technology has been built, and now everyone's looking for application. So it's going to be an application-focused talk. The third one is that this is not going to be a very technical heavy talk. It will assume some understanding, basic understanding, distributed systems and cryptography, but not a lot. If you have any questions about the technical nature of our blockchain or our applications, happy to answer them during Q&A or send me a message over Twitter or my email. Right, that's fine. Happy to engage you guys in discussions. Okay, so the first step. What can blockchain technology actually do, right? So because blockchain is such a new technology, right? So the first thing that we needed to do as a startup, in addition to actually building the technology, building this public chain, we actually need to understand what it can do and what it cannot do, right? So then we can try to fit into actually problems that we see in the real world, right? So there are lots of definitions on what blockchain is. Here, I'm going to present our definition, very simple. We think blockchain system does three things, right? It allows entities to actually commit statements, right? So blockchain allows entities to commit hard-to-fake, easy-validate statements. This is not new. It's just asymmetric cryptography. So it's been around for a long time. The technology has been around for a long time, right? And that's just feature number one. Feature number two, it allows entities to agree on a version of reality, right? So there are these rules that are called consensus algorithms on blockchain systems that allows nodes to come together and agree on this is what reality means for our network at this given time, right? There are lots of different types of consensus algorithms. So a classic one might be what you see on Bitcoin. They're called the Nakamoto consensus, which favors liveness over safety, in that the network always makes progress, but it could be forked later into a different version of reality, right? And then you have these PBFT algorithms, which favors safety over liveness. So if the network is, for example, partitioned, the network could just entirely stall because it's not going to produce a block if it hasn't reached a certain set of quorum threshold, right? So whatever consensus algorithm is used, it allows the network to agree on reality. And the third characteristic is that it allows replication of records, right? So every single node, a full node, actually has a full state replication of everything that's ever happened, right? Not only does it replicate the records, it actually processes the records too, right? So these three things, right, they're based on technology that are not really new. So as you can see, a lot of these technologies had already been in existence long before blockchain came along. But they've been put together in this interesting way, right, that actually produce some interesting properties. So what blockchain system produces is a set of immutable ordered commitments, right? So the immutable part of it comes from the fact that, every single node has a copy, right? So in order for you to really change the record, you got to change a lot of these records. You got to change a lot of these nodes, or bribe a lot of these nodes, or corrupt a lot of these nodes, which are very hard to do, especially considering that they're controlled by disparate entities with not necessarily any overlapping interests. We have ordered, this comes from the agreement on reality, right? Because part of the agreement on reality is that you have to have things in the correct order, right? And commitments, of course, comes from the asymmetric cryptography. So immutable order commitments, very sounds simple, but it actually does a lot of interesting things. Okay. So the next thing to really think about is, okay, so we now know what blockchain is, what it can do, but what are some of its characteristics or limitations, right, that has very critical implications on applications, right? So once again, there are lots of these definitions out there you can find on the web. There are actually also very sophisticated decision trees that people have constructed to help potential technologists or application creators to figure out whether or not they need a blockchain, right? Here we list three characteristics we think are actually very, very critical in their implication on the potential application, what the application should look like, right? So the first one is that blockchain systems are very slow, right? They're very slow compared to centralized systems. So decentralized systems, not surprisingly, always slower than centralized systems, right? So what does that mean? That means is that, you should not really try to replace centralized systems completely with decentralized systems. If you do that, you're going to get very, very, very poor performance, right? So during the early days of blockchain application development, you see, for example, there was an application that allowed people to play poker, right? And every single participant had to, do this commit and reveal scheme on the blockchain, very secure, nobody could cheat. It's great. It took 3 minutes to shuffle a deck, right? So while it's great that you couldn't cheat, are you really going to sit around and wait 3 minutes every time a deck is shuffled, right? Not really. So performance is not great. Second, right, blockchain has very different guarantees depending on the type of data that you're using, right? So this really comes from this, misconception. I know there are books and articles, lots of stuff out there that write, that say that blockchain is this truth machine or a single point of truth, right? So, actually blockchain is not that good at guaranteeing truth, right? It has the same garbage in, garbage out problem that, pretty much all systems have. It really only guarantees veracity when the data is wholly originated and self-contained within the ecosystem, which in the case of cryptocurrencies, it is. But once again, cryptocurrency accounts for a tiny, negligible fraction of data in our world, right? So the vast majority of the time, if you're dealing with things that are outside the blockchain, you cannot rely on it for veracity, right? The third thing is that blockchain is very complex, right? It's super complex to understand. And you definitely don't want to expose that complexity to the end user, right? If you go to a potential customer and you start talking about consensus algorithms and private keys, chances are that customer is gone, within 5 minutes, right? So you must find ways to make rational, reasonable compromises to hide the complexity from the end users, or else you're never going to reach widespread adoption, right, for any of your applications. Okay, so let's go through these one by one, right? So first of all, blockchain is slow, right? At least true blockchain is slow, right? So what makes blockchain slow? Well, there are lots of reasons why blockchain is slow. Here are several. First, we talk about full state replication and execution. So every full node has a copy of everything that has happened on the blockchain and must execute through every single thing, every single transaction on the blockchain, right? So there are some recent advances, with zero knowledge proofs where people can have shorter proofs, but the fundamental principle is still the same in that each full node, in order to remain trustless and guarantee immutability, they need to have a copy of everything, right? So that right away is a lot of redundant space, redundant processing power that you have to deal with. The second thing is that, there's a lot of redundant gossip happening over the network, right? So if you're a full node on a network and you're connected to 10, 20 other nodes, there's a good chance that every single thing that has happened on a network, you'll hear about it like 20 times or more, right? And that's actually, a feature. It's a security feature, right? Because for a node to remain trustless, you can't risk having, that one, node, that one peer that you're connected to becoming corrupted or becoming malicious, and then you becoming corrupted by extension, right? So hearing a lot of redundant gossip is a good idea, because then you have lots of things to check against it, right? But it's not very efficient, right? Once again, it's not very efficient. And true decentralized blockchain networks, you typically have an unstructured peer-to-peer network, right? So you cannot make presumptions about who's in, who's out, where they are, latencies. So none of these things have guarantees, right? So you just have to trust that this sort of very redundant gossip is going to keep you trustless, but very inefficient. The third one is, of course, waiting for agreement, right? So every set of transactions need to be seen and agreed upon through some rule, right? And that rule can be fast, that rule can be slow, but regardless, you have to wait for it, right? So you have to wait for it. So all these things make blockchain systems very slow, right? So what's the implication? So an example implication, once again, is that you really want to use decentralized systems like blockchain to bolster centralized systems, not to replace them, right? So, for example, centralized systems are very mature, they're very efficient, they have very clear legal responsibility, but they do have this one critical flaw, which is that they can cheat, right? They can cheat without you knowing or anyone else knowing, right? So really the goal should be, if we're trying to take advantage of the best of both worlds, is to make sure that you use a decentralized system to ensure that centralized systems cannot cheat. If you achieve that goal, you have effectively gotten the best of both worlds. You've gotten the efficiencies of centralized systems, and you've kept them honest, right? So this is a really, really, I think, critical point, because so many applications towards the beginning of this technological movement just outright move entire application stacks onto the blockchain, which resulted in some very, very poor user experiences, right? Okay. So the second thing, different types of data have different guarantees on blockchain, right? So roughly in this very unscientific chart on the side, I'm trying to demonstrate sort of the relative sizes of different types of data. So we've categorized data into three categories, right? One, type A, is data that's generated on the chain. So this is something like your cryptocurrency, right? Your Bitcoins, your Ethereum coins. These are data that's being generated on the chain, right? Second, right? The second type of data is data that's being generated off-chain, right? But it's actually publicly known data. Lots of people know about it. So this type of data could be things like weather, things like the outcome of sports events, things like that, right? So this is off-chain data, but known to many. And then you have the third type, right? Type C, generated off-chain, but known to a few. This is the vast majority of data in the world, in which only a few people or few entities are privy to the data. For example, my company's financial records, my operational records, the fact that I got into a car accident with Bill last night. I mean, these are things that only a few people know. So there are three types of data, right? With the third type being the most numerous, the most voluminous. Right? So when we talk about blockchain as as it has guarantees on truth and has guarantees on veracity, really only the first type of data has that guarantee, right? You get guarantees on provenance, where the data came from. You get guarantees on immutability, that hasn't been tampered with, and you get this critical guarantee of veracity, that that is true. It's actually it's actually true, right? You only really get that for type A, and it's a tiny bit of data, right? For type B, you have data that's generated off-chain, known to many. You could sort of, get by with the veracity guarantee by using these games, right? So, for example, you have platforms like Augur, you have platforms like Chainlink. What they do is that they take publicly known data, and they have data providers that are randomly selected to provide you data. But at the same time, they have data watchers on the side who actually watch the data that's being provided, and they can expose you if you're telling falsehoods, right? If you're providing the wrong data, then they can expose you. So it's basically a vote in which if you have lots of these watchers saying that you're wrong, right, then you get fined, very heavily, and it's not worth it for you to get fined, right? So it's really through this kind of game mechanism where you have some guarantee on veracity, right? But for the vast majority of data, right, that's in this world today, you don't get any veracity guarantees because, once again, garbage in, garbage out. You don't know what people or entities or machines are uploading, right? But what's very interesting here is that just with provenance and immutability, just those two guarantees are actually very, very, very useful, right? A lot of people will think, well, if you have no veracity guarantee, then, well, everything's out the window. This is completely useless. Well, no, not really, right? So, let's look at a simple example, right? So this example actually this example is actually, I'll tell you the example and I'll tell you about the story that was inspired this example, right? So very interesting. Here you have a hypothetical, supply chain data collection example, right? So you have lots of people along the supply chain, manufacturer, shipper, storage people, retailer, and customer. They're all sort of hashing their data and anchoring it into the blockchain, right? It's great. But of course, you get garbage in, garbage out. There's no guarantee that any of these people or entities are uploading correct data, right? True data, right? But it doesn't matter, right? The reason why it doesn't matter is that you still know who entered that data. And you know that that data wasn't tampered with after it was entered. So you can trace responsibility, right? So the point here is that you can track responsibility, not truth. And here's the interesting story, right? The interesting story is that a few years ago, this is actually even before blockchain even came into my radar field of vision. I was actually, talking to this official from the Chinese agricultural ministry, right? Very interesting. So he was talking about food safety and how there are lots of food safety issues, and they've always wanted to construct a system in which everyone uploaded every single, chain of the food supply ecosystem, right, into their centralized system. And I said, well, what if people enter wrong data, right? And he said, well, I don't care if people enter false data, right? It doesn't matter to me what data they enter, as long as they claim responsibility for a specific segment of the food, right? So his example is very simple. It's very interesting. He said, if someone got sick eating an apple from a supermarket today, it would take me months to track down who was responsible, who was involved in that shipment of apples, right? And by the time I start my investigation, took a few weeks, the news that would leaked out and all the people that were responsible would have changed their records already, and I would never find them, right? That's a big problem, right? He said that if we had a system in which everyone, registered and uploaded their data, I don't really know where the problem is, but I can quickly, zoom in and say, hey, the problem is with these 20 companies, right? He said I could have the police, this can't happen in the US obviously, but it can happen in China potentially. I could have the police round up the CEOs of all these 20 companies and put them in a room and say, hey, I don't know what happened, right? But somebody here screwed up. Maybe one of you, maybe many of you, right? And we're not going to exit this room until we figure out what happened, right? So once again, right, it's sort of an extreme, it's a very interesting example, but it tells you that just the ability to track responsibility, right, is actually really powerful, right? It can solve a lot of problems. You don't care that the data is correct or not, right? So that's the second example. So the third one, right, once again, blockchain is complex, so you gotta try to hide the tech a lot, right? You can't really tell the end user a lot about the technology because that just confuses them and scares them away, right? So, instead of saying things like trustless, you say confident, right? Instead of saying things like immutable, you say secure. Append only, you say auditable, right? Decentralized, you say transparent, right? So use a lot of these words that actually talk about the benefits of the technology instead of the feature themselves, right? And once again, one of the critical examples that we have is you gotta hide the key, right? The secret key is the bane, right? Really the bane towards adoption, right? If the data source is a piece of hardware, for example, we have a use case later, which we'll talk about, then you should really be creating secure hardware that actually generates and hold the keys on the hardware, right? Don't get the user or the owner to deal with these keys. They should not. If they do, introduces a ton of complexity, right? If the user is a person, you can do something like use a password encrypted backup, right? And of the secret key. Store the secret key locally. If somehow they lose it, you can give them a password encrypted backup. If they lose the password, you can potentially reassociate a new private and public key pair through social validation, for example, right? And this is the case when there's no assets involved, right? Where you don't actually even care about the key because it's not tied to any assets. Now, if there are assets involved, right? For example, if the user or person and they're managing, cryptocurrency assets where the key cannot be lost, right? So in that case, you want to go with, hardware multi-signature solutions, for example, with also hardware recovery keys. You have a master key that generates other keys. So you want to, once again, hide the key, right? You don't want to get the user to directly interact with the key. That's just a bad idea. So I think we've all seen applications, decentralized applications, in which right when you open the application, what are you asked to do? You're asked to write down a secret key, and you're told, write it down on a piece of paper. Don't lose it. If you lose it, everything's lost forever. No one can help you, right? So that kind of user experience is guaranteed to lose you almost all your users, right? So hide the key. That's another very critical example, right? So these are some of the lessons that we've learned by interacting with lots of customers and potential customers with regard to what can blockchain technology do, right? So next we're going to talk about our journey in seeking a real world practical application, right, to really deploy this interesting new technology. Okay. So what is our goal here, right? So our goal is actually pretty audacious, I would say, right? To help modern enterprises scale and adapt efficiently to today's rapidly changing environment, right? This actually comes from experiences that I've had running startups, as well as my experience in advice large corporations, right? So once again, nothing's written on this page is anything earth-shattering, right? As you scale as an enterprise from startup into multinational, right? You actually lose a lot of the characteristics that made you successful to begin with, right? So startups, they're inexperienced, they don't have money, they're building everything from scratch, but they have the advantages of being very fast and very responsive, right? They're very, very responsive to the market's changing demands, right? As you start scaling up into a multinational, you have like 10 layers of reporting structure between the CEO and whoever the lowest guy on the run is. Then you start losing all of those advantages, right? You start losing all of it, you become very slow, multi-layered, and God forbid, becomes very political, right, in these organizations. Well, the problem here is coordination, right? So organizations need to coordinate in order to achieve, projects, right? And because our technology has only gotten more and more complex over time, within our civilization, it only gets more complex. To be able to build projects, you need to coordinate with ever more resources, right? Which usually requires coordinating a lot more people, a lot of different entities, right? So that coordination cost just keeps on going up, keeps on going up. And as it goes up to a certain point, you have these companies that are just destined to die, right? Because they cannot adapt, right, to the changing world, right? So how do we change that, right? So how can we help to break this trade-off, right? Because I can imagine very soon, perhaps in my lifetime, where technology is changing so fast and becoming so complex that large organizations become completely frozen, right? Because they're constantly making incorrect decisions, right? So how do we address that problem? Well, blockchain could be a potentially interesting technology to break this trade-off because it allows trustless collaboration, trustless coordination, right? So what does that mean when you translate it into actual real terms? Well, this gets to sort of our journey, right? In terms of trying to find a practical starting point, a practical entry point into solving this problem. So we had a lot of false starts, as most startups do. We were looking at IoT data markets, mobile bandwidth sharing, decentralized certificate authorities, anonymized IoT data gathering. There are a lot of these things that we did that were either too big or blockchain wasn't really a good fit, variety of issues. We didn't really start hitting, the nail on the head until really second half of 2019, so second half of last year, right? When we started finding applications where blockchain is uniquely positioned to actually solve the problem. And that really got us on this path of, helping corporations or helping enterprises collect high confidence operational process data, right? So let's go through some of these examples and why I find them so interesting, right? So the first one is actually an asset leasing example, right? The asset here being arcade machines. So the customer is a Japanese customer. They've been leasing arcades in Japan for 30, 40 years, right? Very well-known company. They started expanding their markets overseas and into Asia and Southeast Asia, right? So East Asia and Southeast Asia. There's a ton of demand in the market. They're working on a model as a profit sharing, as a revenue sharing model, right? Basically, however much the money this machine is earning, they get a cut of that, right? Now, the problem that they run into is that they cannot get into an agreement with their customers as well as their ecosystem stakeholders, right? Exactly how much this machine is earning. Because remember, the machine they're leasing is somewhere else where they can't see it, right? Now, the simple solution, why don't we just put a sensor on it, right? Easy, right? Put a sensor on it and it'll just report back how much it's earning. Well, I mean, that's a problem because their partners will say, well, how do I know? That data comes from the sensor. How would I know that, right? How do I know that you just make it up, right? It's one of these classic cases. It's not that I don't trust you, but I don't trust you, that kind of thing. So they were stuck with over 20,000 orders on their hand, which they don't want to fulfill, right? Because they know that, they'll lose money if they get forced into a fixed fee model, right? So what do, right? So our solution is actually quite simple. So first of all, you still go with the IoT idea, right? You put a sensor on the machine that detects coin, tickets, as well as several current signals that actually goes into the operation of the machine, and to give a feedback on the status of the machine. How many coins got inserted, how many tickets got spit out, where are the machines running, right? Pretty simple. The key difference here is that there are two key differences, right? First of all, in addition to uploading this data into the cloud, as usual, it is periodically hashing the entire data set that's collected for like the past 6 hours, signing it, and uploading that into the blockchain. So it's creating an audit log, okay? The second thing that's special about this solution is that the hardware itself is made to be tamper-proof, right? So there's a secure element on there that's, modern, that's some mature technology in all the credit cards that generates and signs, generates the private key and signs everything with the private key with no way for outside parties to actually read or alter it, right? And the business logic is actually encoded into a MCU with secure boot. And after we enter the business logic, we actually just disable the updating capability, so that basically that MCU becomes completely tamper-proof as well, right? So you have this piece of hardware that's almost basically impossible to tamper with, either remotely or locally, that operates one way and one way only, right? That's actually putting up data into the cloud at the same time anchoring that data independently into the blockchain, right? So later on, you can actually do an audit, right? And what does that audit guarantee? Like we talked about before, it guarantees data provenance and it guarantees data immutability, right? You know exactly where that data comes from, right? Because there's that signature on there, which is not fakeable because it was generated on the module. Someone didn't enter that private key into it. And you also know that it was immutable. It wasn't tampered with because, once again, it was hashed, put into the blockchain, not tampered, right? So what that does is that it helps these parties to drive some baseline consensus, right? You're like, okay, fine. We don't know each other. We're doing business together. At least we can agree on the operational status of these machines, right, from this data, right? So that actually really helps them to expand their market, right? Otherwise, they have a very, very difficult time leasing these machines to parties that hitherto haven't worked with, right? So this is the leasing application, very interesting. The second example is sort of like an extension of the first example, in which we're working with one of the largest automakers in Japan. And they were also interested in exploring what blockchain can do for cars, right? So we brainstormed many ideas, and we're starting to implement a few of them. But one of the things that we started thinking about we thought was very interesting is this idea of used car trading, right? So whenever you buy a used car, at least in the US, right, you're also effectively paying for this Carfax report, which costs $40, right? So when I'm buying a used car, right, I don't know about other people, but when I'm buying a used car, I really worry about two things: mileage and accidents, right? Whether or not it's been an accident. And that's really what the Carfax report does for you, right? It helps you to validate mileage and major accidents, right? So first of all, it's $40, which, I would like not to pay $40. Second of all, there's really no way to independently verify the information that's on these reports, right? So a company like Carfax collects the data from, it purchases the data from lots of insurance and companies and car repair shops. And it aggregates the data using their own secret proprietary algorithm, which you cannot check. and it costs $40, right? So what's really a good solution, right? So once again, if you install this the same secure hardware module into each vehicle, right? The two sensors that you care about are odometer and accelerometer, right? So if I can actually anchor odometer and accelerometer data into the blockchain, the hashes into the blockchain, right? You can later on provide a report that's auditable, where you can actually say, hey, I know exactly how many miles this car has traveled, and I've recorded all major impact events because they're recorded by the accelerometer, right? So that report can be provided to potential buyers of used vehicles at almost no cost, right? Because this is not a company buying data from lots of different other companies. This is just the data that's being generated by the car on its own, right? So once again, you have a much cheaper and far more accurate option, right, in order to prove the history of a used vehicle, right? So here we have a third use case, which really gets very close, right, to the organizational coordination problem that we set out to really resolve, right? So we're looking at the construction industry in the US, right? Specifically looking at construction subcontractors, right? So on a construction job site, what happens is that every single day, no matter if it's a small site, it's a small job or a big job, you have multiple tens of, or up to 100 of, changes that actually happen on a job site. These changes, like, the color needs to change, the window needs to move to this side, like by half an inch or whatever. There's tons of these little changes. And these changes are usually communicated in a very unstructured way. So text, verbal, email, right? I mean, and these are just communicated, people agree on it, and they move on to, keep working on their job, right? The problem is that, a lot of these informal agreements, right, they lead to disputes, right? So most of the time, these disputes are just sort of, doesn't really matter. Maybe it'll cost like, one day, cost a few $1,000. All right, no one's gonna really go to court on that, but these things really pile up, right? So if you have lots of these little, pinpricks of disputes, what ends up happening is that you delay the job by many days, and that's a lot of cost. And it could also lead to litigation, right? So the solution to this, once again, is to use the blockchain to actually build an audit trail of these micro agreements, right? So these participants, these stakeholders, can actually just stay within whatever tool that they like to use, and they could anchor these agreements, right, by cryptographically signing them. Just click a button, you sign it, and it gets uploaded into the blockchain. So later on, these things can be audited, right? So if there are these little disputes about who said what when, you actually get this like perfectly auditable trail of what actually happened, right? So this greatly helps you elucidate and minimize disputes, right? Okay, so we've talked about the technology application fit. We talked about our application seeking journey. So next, we're going to talk about, what are some of the things that we're actually building, right? So to sum it all up, right? So the problem that we're actually solving right now with the application platform that we're building is really trying to resolve this problem of that knowledge and confidence gaps limit scaling, right? So, the modern enterprise today, given a rapidly changing market, you want to be as data-driven as possible, right? A lot of times you actually want real-time operational data instead of, lagging indicators like financial data, right? So you need to know what data to collect, how to collect the data, and how to act on that data, right? So the problem that we're really trying to solve is the second part, which is how to collect that data, right? So data, once again, first of all, is very difficult to collect. And once you collect it, it's actually, it's actually even harder to believe that data. It's even more difficult to believe, right? So what is really driving these problems, right? So hard to collect, right? That's really driven by the fact that, most of the world's operational data, right, process data is actually unstructured, right? We had this report that came out of Box, right, that just said that, over 80% of operational process data in this world are unstructured. They happen over text and email, right? Unstructured information, very difficult to collect. Very few people are willing to use highly structured ways to enter data, like the ERP systems or project management systems that we have today, right? So hard to collect the data. Even when you do collect the data is, very hard to believe because people have no confidence in that data. I've done so many strategy projects where the executives of these enterprises straight up tell me that the data in our ERP systems are not to be trusted, right? It's very simple. It's because these systems do not react and change and adapt quick enough to market conditions. So what ends up happening is that the people who are entering them, their partners and their employees, for example, they would just enter some whatever data they want to enter to make sure they meet their KPIs, right? They're not going to risk the loss of business, in favor of spending time on structuring data correctly, right? So this really limits the enterprise's ability to streamline, to innovate, to forecast, to comply with regulations, and also to scale, right? So what is unique about this type of application that we're building, right? So if we're looking at two axes, right, we're looking at the confidence of the data that you're collecting, how much confidence you have, versus how much time and expense you're expending on getting that data, right? So, at the lower left corner, you have the most informal and the least confident of data types, which is a casual conversation, for example, right? You have a casual conversation and you agreed on something, right? Well, that's not very confident because no one's there to witness it or sign anything, but it costs no time, right? So if you migrate over, you spend a lot more time and expense, you get more confidence, you get into these ERP systems and project management software that we have, right? So, but as we've seen so far, most of that data in enterprises are not really that trusted, right? People think that it's unwieldy, and therefore they just enter whatever, right? So this is only data that's for internal consumption, right? As soon as you get into an external world, for example, you need to share this data with external auditors, you need to share this data with financial institutions, you need to start getting other people outside your company to believe this data. Well, then the price goes way up, right? You got to get, professional services companies to come in, do commercial due diligence. You got to get like the financial auditors or, the ultimate, costly thing, but it's really the final verdict on everything, which is litigation, right? So this is what we have today, right? This is what we have today in terms of how costly it is to collect operational data and how much confidence you have, on operational data, with a big confidence gap in the middle, right? When you go from internal consumption of this data into external consumption, right? So what we're trying to build is that green line on the top left corner, really. So we're trying to really, try to break this trade-off, right? Just try to draw the new curve. Is that we're trying to give you a platform that's able to collect, operations data with, with very, very high level efficiency and with no gaps, right? And this is only really made possible by the decentralized systems like blockchain that actually enable an immutable audit log. Right? So this is roughly what we're building, right? We talked about all the stuff we're building. This is roughly what we're building. You have at the bottom, right? You have the decentralized ledger technology, our Taxara blockchain. And then you go one layer up, then you have these, hardware as well as software brokers, right? So on that side, you can have hardware assets that are uploading information automatically, signing them, anchoring them into the blockchain. And on the right side, then you have people, right, using a variety of, very commonly seen communication tools, right, like email or text or whatever, right? And then all that gets, logged into the blockchain, right? And then we provide a set of functionalities to our application, right? So cross-application collaboration, audit logging, automated or manual classification of the messages that you're trying to audit, visualization, and key management, right? So all this goes to really address the two problems that we're talking about, right? Number one, easily capture and collaborate on unstructured operational data, right? Get that data from the unstructured sources that people are used to using, right? Don't force them to learn a new piece of software, new piece of technology. Just get it from whatever application they're currently using, which tends to be text and email, right? The second is confidently and quickly scale with minimized friction, right? You have lots of confidence in the data that you're collecting because it's easily auditable, right? You have lots of confidence on the fact that it would actually happen with provenance and immutability guarantee, right? So what is this used for? Like, who would ever want to use something like this, right? So besides some of the cases that we mentioned before, we created several categories of enterprises that we think might benefit from this platform, right? So any enterprise that actually deal with complex ecosystems and stakeholders, right? So we talked about cross-border asset leasing. In the case of something like an electrical distribution equipment manufacturer, they need to deal with upwards of 15 to 20 stakeholders for every single project that they work with, right? Getting agreements, locking in agreements between these people is highly complex and time-consuming. So having a immutable audit log, very helpful, right? Second, dealing with enterprises that deal with rapidly changing processes and requirements, right? So, for example, if you're a software outsourcing company, you're constantly dealing with, changing requirements, right? The client signs a contract with you in the beginning, but there's 200 changes coming down the road, right? So lots of these micro agreements happening. You want to make sure to minimize the potential for disputes later on, and not let all these potential disputes derail and overwhelm your operations, right? Third, if you're an enterprise that have distributed or transient workforces, right, this goes into the core of what we talked about, which is coordination problem, right? It's difficult enough to get people sitting in the same room to agree on something. Imagine if everyone is all over the place, right? All over the world, sitting in their separate rooms in different time zones, and imagine 80% of them are contractors that are with you for only part of their day, right? So that coordination problem becomes a nightmare, without some sort of auditable audit log, right? So construction subcontracting, and quite frankly, today we have lots of knowledge workers, under this pandemic, right, that will also benefit from this type of platform, right? And the last category that we've encountered is any enterprise that's in a segment that's heavily regulated and are regularly audited, right? So we met a medical informatics company in Japan, for example. They are, they have tons of patient records on their systems, which they need to regularly share with insurance companies and patients and hospitals, right? They also get audited on a quarterly basis, and every single time they get audited, it's just a nightmare for them, right? It's time-consuming. There are mistakes made, and things don't match up. They need to make tons of phone calls to get confirmations with their partners about who shared what data with you when, right? So if you can, once again, create an immutable audit log, that will make this whole thing much, much smoother, right? That's much less disruptive to their daily operations, right? Okay, so the last slide that I'll talk about is really that, this is really the tip of the iceberg that we're looking at, right? So, with blockchain technology, with something like a decentralized system, it's really a way for people to coordinate, right, with a minimum amount of trust, pre-established trust, right? So the applications that we're building right now, right, is really to streamline distributed work processes. That's what we're doing right now. But really, the big problem that we're trying to solve is to minimize and maybe eliminate coordination costs, right? Imagine if we can do that, then we can scale unbelievably quickly without losing the innovative spark, right? That a company that grew from a startup into a multinational should have retained, right? So this is the beginning of the journey, and I really hope to see these decentralized system technologies like blockchain make a major contribution in space. Okay. So that's really the end of my talk. If you guys have any questions, happy to answer them.
Have to unmute the mic. In any case, looks really interesting. Andy, do you have a question?
The arcade example was interesting because the arcade owner also has another problem. He or she hires employees that he doesn't trust to empty the coin bin. So this also so you also get auditing there, and in fact, as I understand, there's McDonald's now where the in-store deposit thing is actually owned by the bank.
Yeah.
Counts bills while it goes in, and the bank has responsibility from that moment on, which is sort of weird. Car signing the data, though, seems to solve most of the problems, as long as they don't replace the signing module. But if the signing module says, I've been in the car 3 weeks, well, it says 57 Chevy. I know nothing about before 3 weeks ago.
Yes.
But the problem with a lot of the blockchain things is who manages the chain and who pays the costs, because none of your customers want to be in that business.
Want to be in the business of operating.
Managing a blockchain.
Yeah.
Any more than they want to design microprocessors.
Yeah. So let me address the things that you said. So the very interesting that you pointed out about the employees, because our customer, right, which are the arcade operators, right? They have these arcade machines. Yeah. We talked to them, and they said exactly what you said. They said, we need the system too, because every single week we have numbers reported up from our 30 regions across a specific geography, and the numbers always look weird, right? And everyone keeps having weird excuses, every single day about why these numbers look weird. And over time, it's very difficult for them to expand, right? Because they don't feel like they have a good working rapport with their operations team. So that's definitely a problem that they're running into. With regards to the chain problem, who's operating the chain, right? So we are, naturally we are big believers for public blockchains, right? So there are arguments that could be made that private chains are a good sort of gateway drug, I suppose, for enterprises into understanding and becoming familiarized and comfortable with blockchain. But ultimately, we think that public chains are probably the best solution because it's superior in terms of security guarantees. Public blockchains are, once again, supposed to be operated by a decentralized network of operators across the world, right? That's the ideal. Now, thus far, how many networks have achieved that kind of decentralization? I would say very few. Even something like Bitcoin, lots of nodes, but they're probably mostly controlled by a few very large mining pools, right? Probably similar with Ethereum. So it is a difficult thing to achieve, but I hope that later on we can help to achieve that. So the people that are operating the nodes should be disinterested parties, right? So that are operating it because they're getting a cut of the fees for operating this system, right? How cryptocurrency factors into that is debatable. Once again, the market landscape is rapidly changing. What type of does cryptocurrency necessarily need to have a pivotal role in the operations of a public blockchain? The answer would be yes today. I'm not sure whether or not the answer will be yes 10 years or 20 years from now. but it looks like cryptocurrency in ecosystem is probably the best way to guarantee shared interest, in that ecosystem. So once again, to answer your question, is that the customers that are actually using our systems, no, I don't think they would be interested in operating a node. Once again, that's too much complexity for them. So they would be, for example, paying us typical software as a service fees, in which we would then, sort of purchase the privilege of using this blockchain and paying into the system on their behalf, right? But effectively, yeah, they're most likely not going to be, our customers are probably most likely not going to be interested in dealing with anything close to blockchain nodes.
Speaking of arcades, I just remembered the most lucrative arcades in the world.
Slot machines?
Slot machines. And the thing about a casino is every person thinks the people he or she manages are stealing.
Yes.
Every layer. So if I'm a pit boss, all my people are stealing. If I'm running the pit, all the pit bosses are stealing.
Yeah.
If I'm running a floor, etc., all the way up. And
Yes.
at the end of the day, Steve Wynn says, everybody below me is stealing. And so that would seem to be...
yeah, that's what our partner, our business partner in arcade machines also mentioned that. They thought that was a very real opportunity. So they're all Japanese customers, and Japan is supposedly legalizing gambling this year in 2020 in anticipation of the Olympics, which I guess according to, to the virus is pushed next year. But there's a huge market that's being opened up in Japan, potentially with all new machines. Yeah, so very interesting opportunity.
But one of the things is that proof of work can't work, and proof of stake, proof of work doesn't scale. And proof of stake is interesting. It's subject to, I don't know what the official name is, but I call it a curly attack, where if I don't have to get a majority of the coin owners, I just have to get a majority of the people who are staking to agree to cheat everybody else.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm not convinced I'm not convinced that that's not possible.
Yeah, so pretty sure everything's possible. Once again, it's just a matter of how costly you want to make it and how disinterested these parties are with whatever agenda that the militia might be.
Well, the thing about proof of stake is either the tokens that are circulating aren't involved in the verification.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's the people who aren't using it who determine truth.
Yes.
So the more useful the token is, the more the people who don't care about its validity control it.
It's sort of a backwards situation.
Yeah. So
it's backwards.
You're talking about how much liquidity is sufficient to. It's like central bank, right? So in the very beginning, right, you might want to have a very high staking rate, right? Because again, your ecosystem doesn't have a lot of applications in it. And I'm just, once again, this is not a forward-looking statement on how we're structured our.
Yeah.
But just maybe you want to have 90% of it locked up in staking, right?
Right, but then the token's not being used.
Yeah, they're not being used, right?
It's popular. It becomes untrustworthy.
You hope that one day it will be used, right? So, for example, if you have lots of, well, okay, so there are several things here, right? So the tokens really just exist to record things, right?
Yes.
And people who are staking it really are looking at the token as an asset, right? So the asset, the earning power of the asset can be easily securitized into something else which they can trade. It's just that, in terms of, locking capabilities, they're still locked, right? But feel free to trade it, right? To trade the proceeds that you earn from it, right? So if it does happen that, very few chains that run into this problem because there just aren't that many applications. But if it does happen that literally the number of coins that you have divided into the smallest unit cannot support the amount of application volume, then it's time to take a vote and release some of those things in, that are being staked, right? So,
yeah, but the arithmetic is, if it's 10, you start off with 90% staking, which means the tokens are useless. If you're successful, you get to 10% staking, and now 6% can steal from everybody else.
Yeah, it's a bad idea to have 10% stake. I mean, that's just...
Well, right, but if you're, okay, I can change the number to 20%. If you're successful, that number has to go, it has to go down. The more successful you are, the more...
It can go down that much, right? Because then, like you said, you run into a problem where a tiny percentage of...
Right, so the more successful you are, the more vulnerable you are, which is backwards.
Well, you want to make, well, okay, so staking is...
Right, that's your...
Staking, once again, is one form of vote guarantees. There are also other ways of doing it without staking. So you can just not have staking, and then anybody who runs a node who holds a lot of coins in their wallet at the time of voting can vote. Right?
That's staking.
Well, no, staking. So okay, staking usually involves you locking in your coins for an extended period of time. Right.
Right, but a miner, the coin a miner has or controls is a stake. Whether, regardless what label it is, if the miner's assets determine determine voting, then the more that the miners aren't owning all the tokens, the more control the miners have with a small number of tokens. So.
Well, also, I mean, if you are buying up a lot of the tokens, or you're, then you know, the hope is that you now have a quote unquote stake in the fact that these tokens don't go to zero. Right?
I do, because I want to leverage my 3% to steal the other 97%. I'm buying to steal. I'm not buying to.
We're not. So it's, once again, it's obviously a bad idea, right? So it's a bad idea to have so little amount of tokens staked, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's just,
right.
But again, the more successful you are, the more vulnerable you are.
Or you could just make the tokens more divisible. You could also do that.
That doesn't change it.
What do you mean? I mean, we're talking about liquidity.
We're talking about percentages.
We're really talking about liquidity, right? I can infinitely divide that 10%.
Right, but it's still a percentage. My own,
the percentages remain same, right? Because
there's only 100%.
What is forcing you to introduce more supply is that you're running out of money, literally. Basically, you're saying that now one coin is worth so much that it cannot be divided into paying something reasonable.
That's not at all what I'm saying.
Oh, that's not what you're saying.
100%. There's 100%. No matter how you divide it, there's 100%.
Yes.
There's not 101. There's not 99.
Yeah.
No matter what you do, there's only 100%. And if 90% is off doing work and 10% is allocated to doing verification, I only have to own 6% to control the 94%.
Right, but you wouldn't ever
do the right 6%.
Yeah.
I have to not be using my 6% to do work. I have to be using my 6% to do validation. And if I own the 6% that's being used validation, I can steal the other 94%. Because I own 6%, I own 60% of the voting stock. Because the other 94%, the other 90% is out doing work.
Yeah, but you can just make a requirement in the network that you have a very high quorum requirement, right?
Which means the coins are useless.
At any given time, 75% of it has to be voting and stake, right?
Yeah, which is lack of success. It's like saying your bank has to have 90% of the money in the bank. There's no money out in the world.
I mean, the coin has two roles here, right? I mean, one role.
That's the problem.
It's
Yes.
it's a asset. It's a revenue earning asset that gives you
Mhm.
voting rights. The other
Yeah.
role it has is to access a ledger to pay fees, right? That's
Yeah, and so if 60% is used for validation, I cause inflation when I move it out into the world, or deflation, one of the two.
yeah. I mean, you have incentives set.
Yeah, you got to be very careful. So there's no right staking rate is my claim.
Well, I mean, once again, these
Yeah.
systems are difficult to get right. I don't know that anyone has gotten it right. Just have to keep experimenting, right?
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting. There's going to be new forms of crime. Yay.
Well, I'm not so sure, Andy, that it's going to be new forms of crime. If the experience with with Bitcoin was any example, it was pretty much collusion and ownership acquisition through collusion.
Uh, New ways to, right, there's only 13 stories in the world, and we name the character Han instead of Hans.
Well,
And suddenly it's a $4 billion business.
could be.
Uh,
In any case, this is a very nice system that you put together, Stephen.
Oh, thanks.
It seems like a way to make Bitcoin, or rather blockchain technology, accessible and usable in a reasonable way. And that seems to be something that's definitely a desire of the marketplace at the moment.
Mhm.
cool.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Thank you,
Bye.
Andy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.